Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. Hi, I'd like to welcome you all to this Columbia Institute for Teleinformation and International Media Management Academic Association joint seminar, part of our monthly seminar series. I'm Jason Buckwhite, the Executive Director at the Columbia Institute for Teleinformation. Usually I'm in the background. Today, unfortunately, Professor Noam is not here, so he'd asked me to step in and lead this session, which I look forward to. We have a great guest today, Amie Stepanovich, the Vice President of U.S. Policy at the Future of Privacy Forum. Amie is an internationally recognized expert in all things technology and policy and law, specifically domestic surveillance, cybersecurity, and privacy law. She served as a board member of the International Internet Education Foundation, as well as the Security Research Legal Defense Fund. She's also one of the most well-known leaders in law and policy, even being recognized by Forbes Magazine as one of the 30 under 30. And so we're very fortunate to have her today to speak on how to design policies for privacy in the workforce. And so, Amie, I'd like to turn it over to you. Really looking forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks.
Thanks so much, Jason. Hi, everybody. I see that people are still joining the Zoom as I start just kind of slowly sharing my slides and getting my own screen set up. It's really a pleasure to be here today. Normally, FPF hosts calls like this, and I go by what I call the popcorn rule, which is once you can count to 3 in between people joining is when you should get started talking, much like when you should take a bag of popcorn out of the microwave in seconds between pops. It is a particular joy for me to be here today because for those of you who don't know, I'm about to out. Jason and I were old law school classmates. So being able to share a screen with him is always a particular pleasure and honor. And so Jason, thank you so much. I am very just so happy to be able to be here with you today, as well as the rest of you. I will be, as Jason said, talking about looking at designing policies and what is necessary for using AI, and here particularly generative AI in the workplace and for organizations. So this is all different types of organizations, from nonprofits through private sector, big and small, and what is necessary, what people should be thinking through if you want your teams to be using these types of tools. So a little bit first about the Future of Privacy Forum, where I am really privileged to find my own professional home. FPF is a global nonprofit organization. We are based in Washington, D.C. That's where I am today. But we also have offices in Brussels, in Singapore, and in Tel Aviv. We bring together academics, civil society, government officials, and industry to talk about all of the different dimensions of data uses, identifying risks of those uses, and trying to help develop appropriate protections. We take that second F in our name very seriously about being a forum. We don't want to represent any specific interests, but really are focused on the idea that when you bring people together and have conversations, you end up with better conversations, better work product, and better ability to understand the world around you. Just one more little bit about us. We are home to 200 plus companies. That might seem like the company sector is a little bit outsized in our community. However, those are companies from across basically every sector you can imagine, from banking to toys, regular, what you would call internet companies, car manufacturers, people with very different interests in the space, sometimes the same interests and sometimes very much at odds with one another. We also have 45 academics from around the world, 20 plus civil society organizations represented, and we are home to 50 plus staff and fellows. I actually think that's closer to 80 now. It's been really wonderful to see some of the growth. We work on every single issue. We have the great privilege of being able to go really deep on privacy. So we can talk about privacy in ad tech and AI and with youth and mobility and location information, biometrics, and have people who are able to be deep deep experts on each of those individual areas that a lot of organizations only get to have one person who does all of privacy and has to cover all of these areas just by themselves. So it's been a joy to be able to be here and be a privacy nerd alongside a lot of other privacy nerds. I said we're here to talk about generative AI. Many of you will already know a lot about what I'm about to say because you could not have lived anywhere on earth, I think, this year and not have heard a little bit about generative AI. I think even people who don't have internet connections at this point know what generative AI is. But for anybody who may not have dug deep into it, generative AI is the specific subset of AI used to describe algorithms that are creating new content. That content can be audio, code, images, text, video. If you've used Stable Diffusion, ChatGPT, DALL-E, Google Bard, has anybody here, I was going to say used, but I feel like, has anybody here not used generative AI tools? Can you raise your digital hand? So this is about what I would expect. There are 0 digital hands that have gone up, which means everybody is at least representing that they have had some sort of direct access to these tools. You might have also heard the term large language models. These are AI tools that specifically read, summarize, and translate text, which means you can use real human text input, and the tools will be able to understand those words, know what you mean, and be able to provide you with some sort of content and response. I did get one hand from somebody who hasn't used, I assume that was a hand for somebody who hasn't used generative AI, which is very good to know. There are still somebody out there. So we started looking at generative AI, specifically its use in the workplace, because we were hearing from a lot of people in our community that their teams wanted to be able to use these tools in different ways, and they weren't sure if they could, they weren't sure how, they weren't sure of the risks or the repercussions. We approached this idea with generative AI as a tool. So not necessarily as something revolutionary, definitely not as magic, even though it can seem that way for a lot of people. It is a tool that can be used in different ways, and it can also be abused, misused, and we want to empower people to use it effectively and safely with respect to privacy and organizational security. To do that, we focused on pushing organizations to develop internal policies and procedures around when their employees, their staff, their teams can use generative AI tools. A lot of organizations were at the time, and even have continued to, support bans on the use of generative AI within the organization for work purposes. And we were hoping we could come and provide a path toward eliminating or at least limiting the bans, and looking at really productive, positive uses that could benefit everybody. I'm going to ask one more time a slightly separate question, which is, how many people here have used generative AI for a work purpose? Not for something personal, but for their jobs. So a few hands are continuing to go up. It's really interesting when you start digging into it. I had a team member very early on who had used it to help develop a spreadsheet on if they had achieved the goals they had set out for themselves or made progress on those goals throughout the year, and had fed prompts into it to help develop tools to track progress on policy goals, which I thought was very interesting and underlines a point that we didn't want to think through the fact that it wasn't useful for everybody. It wasn't useful in ways that we personally couldn't predict it to be useful for. Everybody has their own brain, their own imagination, and can see these tools in their own life, in their own work, being used in many different ways. To develop this checklist that I'm going to present in just a minute, we consulted with experts from 30 different companies and organizations to talk about what they had seen and encountered, what questions and problems they had had, and what opportunities they were hoping to take advantage of. Some of them had policies in place already. Many of them did not. Most of them did not. We were seeking to understand both the current uses as well as anticipated uses of generative AI in the workplace, with a focus on harm, benefit, governance, and security. We did look at a lot of existing policies that people had developed around generative AI in order to think about what other organizations would need to have in place. And we found that they were not necessarily equivalents to one another. Many organizations had thought about things that others had not. So we had to look at all of them holistically and put together observations from across every different place that we talk to people from, to be able to find out what really were the questions that had to be asked before a policy could be put into place. One more question, just because I find that when I talk, it's useful to know who I'm talking to. Do any of you work at a place that has a policy around using generative AI tools, either specifically or just using tech and AI tools more generally in the workplace, where they have given you feedback or information on how to or how not to use tech tools? I'm getting an actual visible head shake from Jason, which is very good visual inputs, because I think a lot of times when we're on these Zoom calls, we don't get that visual input anymore. So thank you for that. So this is our guide that we ended up coming up with. I'm going to quickly also drop the link to it in the chat for this call. So if you all, like me, are visual learners or are people who benefit from being able to browse through text while you're hearing it explained, feel free to click on that and you can read through and access the checklist yourself. We have specifically decided that this should be a public available resource and not something just for our members in our community, but something that people can read, put into practice, and then provide us feedback on if they have any comments or questions about what should be in part 2.0. And I will get to some of the things that we've been thinking about before the end of the presentation. So what we have learned, there are a lot of different use cases for generative AI, from human resources, use in security departments, for operations, for legal. There is no real limit to the end of where generative AI can be used. Policies also, though, need to adapt to the needs of all of those different departments. You can't just recognize that it can be used in those places without trying to specifically accommodate for all of those uses. Good policies, I will say this again because I think it's important, allow folks to tap into the positive use cases for generative AI and discourage bans. We saw bans that were absolute. You will not use these tools on any device that has work product for any work purposes, and some that were more permissive or more targeted. Don't use it for this, don't use it in this case, don't use it unless you hear from us affirmatively that you can use it for this specific use case you're asking for. Most, as I said, most didn't have a policy in place when we started the process. Most still didn't have a policy in place by the time we ended the process. We have been going out into the world and sharing the potential and the benefits of having a process in place. And so I'm slowly seeing those numbers actually start to go up around organizations that have policies in place, which is really good to know. Even though they didn't have a policy in place, those organizations did have to implement basic positions really quickly. And I think that's where we saw the bans. They hadn't thought about these technologies in advance. They weren't prepared for them. And so when they started being used, and we started seeing earlier this year, the real explosion of generative AI tools, nobody was prepared for it. And so something had to be put on the book, something had to be communicated really, really quickly. And organizations didn't have time to dig into the details. So why did we do this? I have a picture of these two gentlemen on this slide, Roberto Matta and Peter LaDuca. If you don't know the names, you probably know the story of the two lawyers in the US who used generative AI tools to write their legal brief and ended up inputting, citing 2 totally fake cases that the generative AI tool had hallucinated into existence. They cited them to the court, and they ended up with a pretty substantial sanction for having done so, when the other side pointed out that these were not real cases. Don't be those people, is really our kind of basic point. So the checklist has 4 sections: compliance with law and policy, training and education, disclosure and transparency, and a focus on outputs of generative AI. And I'm going to go into all of those very briefly, but in a little more depth than is on this slide separately. So for law and policy, this was our longest section. It had 8 items that we asked people to account for, because you are going to have to respond both to general law and policy requirements around data, around intellectual property limitations, as well as if you are working in a specifically regulated sector. So for instance, in the US, education or banking, you really need to be thinking through the sector specific rules that are developed and that apply within your sector. Look through not only your own use, but vendor use, and making sure that your vendors using generative AI are in compliance, that you've incorporated generative AI into your enterprise risk management processes. You're not putting, we have strongly encouraged organizations to tell their employees to avoid inputting any sensitive or confidential information unless you have special controls, so you have an enterprise service yourself. And you should have a preference that you have communicated on the use of generative AI on work issued versus personal devices. Training and education, we had 5 items. This was a very important space. We often tell people when we're in the policy world on privacy, we say, you should train your people on ethics. Don't just tell them about the tools, but train them on the underlying factual limitations. Make sure they know they have to fact check. This was the most fun one when we actually took this checklist to integrate it into our work at FPF. This was really the fun one we had the most fun with, because we had to then go out and find the tools that were available to people on training. And this is going to be one of those big questions that we had to come back to later, because we realized there's not a lot out there for people who need to get their employees, get their teams access to the specialized training that can be necessary to understand the full contours of how to use these tools. And so there's a potential market need for more in this space. And I think it's an area to really dig into in more depth and detail as we move on. We then talked about disclosure and transparency around when you use the tools. Making sure that you have policies in place for when people and how people can create accounts for these tools. Do you want people using their, for instance, personal Google accounts to utilize Bard for work purposes? Or should work purposes only be operationalized under an account created with your work email? We strongly have recommended that there are documentation procedures available for people to track how they have used these tools, but also that those documentation procedures have to be logical and live in a way that the person can actually use them. If you are creating new or utilizing new and separate tools to document every single use, and you're creating huge burdens for your teams to do so, then it's not going to be functional. People aren't going to do it. They will find every opportunity to route around doing that. This is well documented, not only in the AI space and the documentation space, but every single area that I have ever studied or heard study of. So you have to give people tools where they exist, and then set standards for transparency around the use, both internally and externally. Let people know how they can tell you if they use generative AI in producing a document, how they used it, and how they fact checked it to some extent. This has to be pretty, we recommended pretty direct language that the organization chooses to use for that. And for it to be tailored to, this was used for a research purpose, this was used for drafting, this was used for early drafting, making sure that you aren't making the disclosure so broad that it doesn't really define what the use was, which means that when you follow up, you can't talk to the team member about that use in any detail because you're not totally sure where generative AI came into their process. And then the final piece was outputs. This was our shortest piece. I think it's also the piece where we need the most information and study in the future. Scheduling reminders for employees to verify all of their outputs. This is really particularly important when there is a legal requirement for accuracy, such as when you're citing court cases in a filed legal document, but also for anything that you are going to file to a government agency, to a compliance official, where you have to have verified that the information in a report is correct. Understand that generative AI tools implicate intellectual property and have a policy that you have thought through about how you want to deal with that. And my supervisor felt most strongly about this for many reasons because he was a coder in the past. But we think it was particularly important to have a section that talks only about coding outputs, because it's one of the biggest areas where generative AI tools have been used in the workplace, and checking coding outputs for validated security vulnerabilities. Oftentimes you will put in that you want some sort of code outcome to do a certain thing, and generative AI tools are pretty good at creating code that can do that thing. But we know a lot of vulnerabilities exist in these codes at this point. And we've found those vulnerabilities actually are not accounted for in the outputs of generative AI. And so you have to check for them manually in many cases to make sure that even if the code you get functions, that it's not going to create bigger security problems for the organization. So I've alluded to a bunch of big questions that we still had at the end of this process. And these big questions continue. They're things that we are likely to explore in our work in 2024, and we would love to work with others in exploring. The first one was, when is transparency necessary and how do you do it? I said that we hoped that people would have specifically directed language for people to use, but it was unclear at what point any contribution was significant enough that it should require some sort of transparency about the use of generative AI. If you're only using it in basic research or broader research behind something, do you have to say that, or should you have to say that in the end product? Probably not, but there's no real bright line between when you're crossing over from basic kind of behind the scenes work into this is really making its way in a solid, measurable way into the final product. The second one was, what are the best training tools for employees? Again, we have taken this checklist, implemented it ourselves. And when we got to training, what we found out is there is a lot of snake oil, a lot of trainings that have material that is going to be irrelevant for your team members, your employees, your staffs. And because it has a lot of irrelevant material, those trainings end up being quite long. Think 2 or 3 days worth of training, when 2 of those days are not covering topics that you need your team to understand, or potentially topics that they have received in other trainings, so they're redundant. So we are looking for more tools that are around the use of AI or the use of technology in workplace functions. The third was what to do about creative inputs. It is impossible. I put hard or impossible. I'm going to stick with impossible to know what creative material was used in helping to build a specific output of generative AI. But we know that artists' materials are being used as the basis in the training material behind what we are generating, be it visual, be it text-based, the work of journalists, the work of authors, of all different backgrounds, and how to make sure those people are getting adequately compensated for the work that you are producing using generative AI tools that were built on their work is really difficult without knowing who has influenced the product that you have received. Token donations, you can donate to artistic organizations or organizations that support or fund artists, but those aren't necessarily going to get to the right people. They also might not get to the populations of artists and authors that need them most. And so we've already seen with the writer's strike, with a number of actions this year, the very strong, and I would argue justifiably strong reactions that creative minds are having toward the use of these tools being trained on their work. But we don't know how to respond to that. Generally speaking, you wouldn't want to put the onus on some sort of overall regulatory scheme or function that can make sure those people are getting compensated. It's hard to put the onus on the end user to do something here, but we don't have those schemes in place yet. And so thinking through being a user of these tools can be really important. And then finally, how do you know where the data is going? On one of the previous slides, I shared the image of Samsung unwittingly putting their internal notes into a generative AI such that it could be accessed by a future party. Generative AI tools produced by different companies have different rules for when the queries that people put in are going to be used in further training of the algorithm of the function, which means they might be able to be accessed in other outputs. If you can find that information for the tool you're using, you really need to seek it out and include it or account for it in a policy, but a lot of them don't make it clear. And so how to be very clear and how to require organizations to tell you what will happen with the data that you're putting in is, we think, one of the most important things and one of the biggest barriers toward organizational use, knowing that your data, your internal private information, private to the individual, private to the organization, is not going to find its way back out into the public. So as I said, find the checklist and more at fpf.org or at the link I placed in the chat. That's my presentation. I went about 6 minutes longer than I thought I was going to, so I apologize for rambling on a little bit, but I'm happy to discuss any part of this, our work in general, or any other questions you might have.
Oh, thank you so much, Amie. I think that was really interesting, and I'm sure that everybody in the crowd are definitely digesting everything you had to say. So I would like to invite everyone now, anybody that does have questions, comments, anything you'd like to say, please use the raise hand function, and I'll be glad to acknowledge you. And while people are queuing up at the mic, I actually do have a question for you myself. So you talked about transparency and the fact that, wanting to get it out there that you're using AI. We have in the hospital by me here in New Jersey has been having a lot of issues. About a year and a half ago, they made a big deal about the fact that they had the first AI read mammography system in the region, and that it's a great system, it's wonderful, and they even claimed, I think, that it was 20% more accurate than being read by a human. To the point where there's billboards on the road saying, come to our place, we have AI mammography. A year later, that same billboard is a law firm advertising the fact, hey, did Hackensack Meridian misread your mammography? We'll sue them. So my question to you is, especially as human nature right now does seem to be very distrusting and worrisome about AI, do you think that those policies could open you up and open the companies up to mistrust, concern, even lawsuits of the use of their artificial intelligence?
So this is a great example. I love this, and I'm glad I know it now because I'm going to work it into future talks that I give. So thank you, Jason.
No problem.
I think it raises so many questions. First of all, they say 20% more accurate. 20% for whom is the first question I have. Because we know a lot of algorithmic tools and AI tools are incredibly biased. And so they might be more accurate for certain populations, but less accurate for others. And it's vital that you know that question before you start relying on AI tools. In my training slide, I didn't directly address it, but I have written down a lot on bias training for anybody using AI tools. People have to understand that the inputs for these tools are often biased, either in the way that the material gets weighted or because they are relying on information that is historically biased. It turns out humans have historically not always been great. In fact, we've been pretty not great. And relying on historic data without trying to adjust for who is going to use the tool ends up being a way to produce bad outputs. The other point is, are you using AI to augment already existing functions? Do you have a human who is what they call human in the loop? Do you have a human who's going to be double checking things, looking at things, making sure that the AI isn't catching anything obvious? Or are you using the AI as a substitute? And we found that certain communities, again, people of color, poor communities, end up seeing places where AI is used as a substitute and not an augment more frequently than others. So at the end of the day, I'm glad that we are challenging the use of these tools, especially for something as important as its use in healthcare, because that billboard, at least, that you described doesn't answer these really important questions that you need to answer and that patients will need to understand and medical staff will need to understand for its use in these contexts. I'm also, though, not going to speak to if those questions were answered and if it was a good use, because a billboard is not necessarily a place where you put a lot of text and legal disclaimers.
None whatsoever.
And so figuring out what actually happened in that case and what was revealed about the use, I think will be equally as important. And why you need to go back to the central point I've been using the whole time, why you need a policy before you start to implement these tools in any professional function.
Great, thank you so much, Amie. So I see that we have a couple hands up. Dwight Herpinger, you have the floor.
Hi there, it's Dwight in Canada. I'm just wondering if you have any comments on the use of generative AI as a filter for engagement. For the average person, I think their first encounter with generative AI would be customer service, with companies in a broad swath of sectors. And just as we endured the, press 1 for this, press 2 for that, and now a promotion for this thing that you're not interested in. And it's immediate and it's enduring, and the average person is experiencing generative AI all the time now and are singularly unhappy with it. So I'm just curious about how that figures in the grander scheme of things.
Yes. So as somebody who, if any of you joined early, you heard me telling Jason that my week this week has been a comedy of errors. So I've actually spent a lot of personal time on the phone this week with customer service for a variety of reasons. And if I didn't know before this week about the problem of these tools, I do know now. I think this one thing that this raises for me is underlining that importance of being transparent about the use of generative AI. People need to know they are not interacting with what they normally would think of as a bot, because they're going to be confused. The answers are going to be maybe a little more sophisticated than what they would think of as a bot. The number of times people have raised questions about, I'm not just getting like technical responses like I'm used to, I'm actually getting human-based responses. I don't know if this is a human. People should be clear that they are operating with generative AI. And if the responses are not responsive, that there is an alternative method that they can pursue to reach a human. I think that, again, when you look at augmenting, this might allow customer service to act more quickly in the long run if used properly. Anybody, and I'm sure many of you have, who's experienced a 30, 45, 1 hour long wait time for customer service for something that you just need a quick answer on, might appreciate in the long run, when a generative AI can actually understand what you're asking and provide you the right answer. But if you don't know you're interacting with a generative AI and you don't have an option to reach a human when that tool is failing, which it will do, I think we are moving from that augment bucket to that substitute bucket. And it's going to fail a lot of communities. And again, probably the communities that are underrepresented in the training data.
Just quick follow-up. Are there any standards that are emerging to properly make that transparency obvious?
None that I've seen, which is why this is something that's on my own personal goal bucket for 2024 is to work on this. And I will say, I think it gets, when it's a chat or email, it's pretty solvable. But when you start getting into phone customer service, or anything audio based, you, I think, have significantly bigger issues telling people that you're interacting with generative AI, making them aware, and making them aware in a way that persists through the entire conversation, that it is still generative AI from the beginning to the end, because they're not staring at that disclaimer in front of them for the whole conversation. It is, by nature of the medium, time-based, because you can't give a screen for it. So not only do I think that there aren't necessarily the right standards in place, but I don't know if we've really wrapped our heads around how those standards are going to be implemented in new technologies, or old technologies. The phone is by far not a new technology, but I'm thinking of the new generation of Meta Ray-Bans are going to have audio outputs that we're going to need to figure this out for, that they've already announced will have generative AI in them. And really immersive technologies as a whole, augmented and virtual reality, we're going to need to think through it there too. So I am less worried about developing standards in text than I am in audio visual.
So I see that Alan has his hand up. Alan Z, the floor is yours.
Great. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, Amy, for a great presentation. And I have a couple of questions. The first is, have you looked at the draft regs coming out of California on large language model AI? And the second one being, do you know of any companies that have successfully lobbied to a vendor or provider if they were using an LLM and had actually done their own internal PIA?
Can I just clarify on your second question? Do you mean verified that the vendor did a PIA, or did their own PIA on the vendor's work?
No, they did their own PIA. The customer did their own PIA on the vendor.
I know more of the former vendors who have done PIAs, and then customers who have requested them and received them in some cases, in order to evaluate if they were going to use that vendor. I know fewer cases of customers doing PIAs on a vendor's software, and I'm sure there is a case out there, but I don't know if I can name any that I've personally come into contact with. I think that's much harder to do and to pursue for a variety of reasons, some of which is that information is not typically all information that vendors make publicly available. So they're able to do their own and tell you the results of their PIA, but they're not necessarily going to give you the full amount of information about their systems to do an adequate PIA, which, if for anybody who doesn't know acronyms, I worked at a university for a few years and we had a no acronym policy that has stuck with me forever. Is PIA's privacy impact assessment. I think that is currently not the norm, and I'm not sure we're going to reach a point, unless it is legally required for that to be the norm into the future. But I don't think that eliminates the necessary to do your due diligence with all of your vendors and at least get information from them on their own PIAs, where they send data, how they use data that is sent to them, etc. On the draft regs coming out of Colorado, Colorado is also doing regulations. It turns out to be the C states. On the draft regs coming out of California, we have looked at those, we've analyzed them. I think they're pretty early in the process, but clearly California, they have said out loud that they consider themselves an AI regulator. The Colorado Privacy Protection Agency, CPPA. So they are looking at these tools very closely. Definitely, I think we're going to see progress on that. I'm not 100% sure the extent to which these early draft regulations are going to be what is seen in the final, but we're going to keep analyzing what comes out and trying to engage. We're also looking ahead at what they do when they are starting to enforce outright the California Privacy Protection Act, CPA, the agency. There's so many C's and P's in California privacy acronyms. And that the enforcement starts in 2025 without a right to cure. So I think both there's the AI regulations and there's going to be their outright enforcement of their privacy regulations, which will have an impact on AI. We like to say that data protection laws, privacy laws are the basis for any AI regulation. I'm looking at the data that feeds the AI system. So yes, you probably do need standalone AI regulations, AI legislation, but first you need to look at the data protection work. And my colleagues in Europe have shown that the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, has already been regulating AI tools and automated decision-making tools for many, many years now, and have written actually a whole report on that, which is also on our website.
Thank you very much. Oh,
thank you.
Follow-up?
Well, just on back to the PIA, because if you do look at early privacy regimes and standards of practice, you will see that if you're sending data up to a vendor, that's one of the requirements to do a thorough on-site evaluation of a system. So I can't imagine that you don't know where this data is going once it goes into this vendor's ecosystem of AI, that you somehow can prove where your PII is without doing a thorough evaluation on site. Anywhere from the physical security right on down to, of course, the interconnected electronic elements. So I'm surprised about your answer about that.
Well, and I think that there are evaluations of where the data is going that you see with enterprise services that are not what I would call a full privacy impact assessment, but are still looking at like, where is the data that we are feeding into this vendor going to end up? That's not analyzing the full system, but that will give you information about what you're feeding them. And you do tend to get answers on those. And I know people ask those questions and get answers on them. I'm just more thinking about a third party going and doing a PIA of their vendor specifically, as opposed to their interaction on themselves and their interaction with the vendor.
Yeah, well, in practice, that is more of the case when you are using cloud providers. You do have these provisions where you go and can physically go and evaluate the vendor. I've done many of those myself. So I can't imagine, especially in AI and how vulnerable it really is because of the bleed through into its general learning model, that your PII can wind up, being exposed inadvertently without sufficient controls.
Most of the cases we've heard of that have been employees using tools outside of a policy, and definitely not with an enterprise service. And then they end up putting sensitive information into the tool and not knowing themselves where that data is going to go, and it ends up on the other side. So these are not necessarily enterprise tools nor approved tools by the organization.
Thanks. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Alan. So I just want to remind everybody, if anybody has any questions, please feel free to raise your hands or to drop a question in the chat, and we'll recognize it and bring it up to Amie. Does anybody have any questions? Anything? Not hearing any. So Amie, I do have a question for you. In terms of basically following the chain, how far up and how far down the chain of control should a company look in terms of its policies? Basically, obviously, the direct connection makes sense. For instance, if I'm dealing with Adobe Photoshop and they use an AI service that allows me to integrate AI into my photoshopping, then I should know their direct policy. But what about the company that they're using and the company that that company is using, and so on and so forth? And similarly, if somebody's hiring me, how far down the chain should I be telling people of, hey, I'm the intermediary that Netflix uses to handle their hosting, and we use AI for our traffic management, and you are a customer of Netflix, and we should tell you because you're a customer of Netflix.
I'm like very quickly reminded of liability questions.
Yeah.
And I think, so I'm not a practitioner, but I would say my advice here would be, my non-legal advice here would be that you're going to want to look to any extent to which data is actually fed into a system. So if you have a vendor that's providing a piece of the technology you're eventually building into your final product that you are then selling to other people, and that piece of technology is just something you have taken, implemented, nothing goes back to the company who developed it. I don't know if you're going to have to go all the way down to that level. Most tools at this point are just a combination of many, many, many other tools in the tech space. My vastly simplified way of describing tech today. And there does need to be a real limit on how far you have to due diligence. But if something is if somebody is actively tracking, monitoring, collecting information, using that integration, then I think that's when you're going to have to start analyzing backward and trying to figure out what is happening with data, because I think that's where regulators are going to be holding you responsible, which means if you haven't gone at least that far back to where the information you're collecting is ending up, you're putting yourself at risk of running afoul of regulators. You're putting yourself at risk of running afoul of public trust and ending up in a lot of headlines that you don't want to be in. And those are all different risks for the organization that your risk model, your risk management should be picking up.
So to build off of that, in a more general question, do you see these individual corporate policies or even organization policies being a good salve in handling the issues of privacy? Or do you think that regulators are almost assuredly going to have to step in and create a more global, more onerous set of policies and regulations and laws? Or is this a stopgap basically for a couple of years until the EU, the US, et cetera, can come up with more overarching stuff?
So I wouldn't say it's a stopgap. I say they work together. Okay. The policies I'm talking about and I am very supportive of are essentially, it's end of year planning. I've been using this word a lot. I'm going to use it now. Pushing organizations to make intentional decisions about how they want to see their tools implemented within their four corners, where they can be useful, where they don't want them to be used, and how they can be implemented. But if you look at our law and policy section, in several different places, we say, make sure you're complying with existing law. make sure you know that what your obligations are to regulators. And so having a privacy law, I think, is absolutely necessary in all jurisdictions where you want to see AI used and flourish. I would say the lack of a comprehensive federal privacy law in the US is one of the presents one of the biggest risks for general broad use of AI within the US. I think we need that basic level. And then the policies that organizations put in place should reflect that and should make sure that they're in compliance, make sure they're doing what they need to do. And again, making sure that they are making intentional decisions where they have space to do so in excess of that, of whatever law is on the books. But I don't think you have a law and then you don't need a policy. And I don't think the policy stands to do what a law can do. Those things really do have to be operating hand in hand.
Okay. Does anybody else have any questions for Amie? Not seeing any. So I would like to thank you and bring this this talk to a close. It's been a wonderful talk. This is the final CITI-IMMAA event for the year for 2023. So I would like to holidays and a happy new year as well. And we will be reconvening next year, January 11th, with an excellent guest from Germany. So we will be sending you out more information about that as the event comes closer. Take care, everybody, be safe and have a wonderful new year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.